Greetings and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tal. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerers Guild. Today on Magical Theory, we are going to be talking about the ego or the self. Now, the ego has gotten a lot of bad press lately. Yeah, we talk about these ideas of ego death or even ego removal and transcending the ego. Okay, now these are valid concepts and they have their place, but we don't want to be constantly in a state of ego death. We wouldn't have any volition, we wouldn't have any will, we wouldn't do anything without some sense of self. So what we're looking for with these ideas of transcending the self is more about changing the self, and like, what having to do with your shadow work. But then we have ideas like ego death. And often some of the gnosis some of the states of gnosis that we try to achieve, we're going past the ego, to transcend the ego, if you want to call it that, and simply reaching out. Okay, we want to think of this like a finesse, yeah? That's what ego death is for. It's like if you've ever tried to grab a leaf in the water. If you hold your hand wide like this and try to reach up to the leaf, the water pushes the leaf out of your grasp, especially if you try and grasp fast, because there's more water there's more water moving, there's more disturbance in the water, and that disturbance reaches in front and pushes the leaf away. The ego is your hand wide like this, reaching for that bit of that attainment of knowledge, or when we're in gnosis, that finesse that we need to really be able to move that one piece just the way we need. And it helps us also get rid of this idea of lust for results, because if we leave the self behind, we are no longer lusting for the result. But we do need to retain enough of the self, even in these situations, to know what our desire is, to cling to our intent. And our intent is part of ourself, even then. Even when we go into these ego deaths, right? Unless you're just there for entertainment, I suppose, then you went there seeking something. You went into that ego death with an intent. And even then, we need to cling to this idea of intent. We leave behind the lust for results, but we keep the intent even as we achieve ego death. So even then, there is some sense of self, yeah? And in fact, in more ancient times, yeah, one of the maxims of spellcraft was know thyself. That's what was written on the temple to Apollo in Delphi. Know thyself. Well, what is thyself? The self. That's the ego, yeah? We need to know our ego. We need to understand it. And people talk a lot about discovering themselves. Well, to me, this is kind of a misnomer, because the self is malleable. And that's one of the first things we need to understand, is that we're not the exact same person from moment to moment. There is a core of what we are. Yeah, and I suppose that's the self that we're trying to know. But the outside of the self changes, and even that core can sometimes bend. So it's not about discovering the self as much as understanding the self. And part of that understanding the self is to take that the next step further, yeah? And it's not about discovering the self, but creating the self. Because once we understand that the self is malleable, that opens us up to this idea of paradigm shifting. Because the self is how we perceive. There is our perception, which is our ultimate I, as in I, or I. It's an interesting pun in the English language, is that I and I sound like words, because they are what we are. I mean, not literally your I, but that idea of seeing, perception, and I. Your core is simply your perception, simply the fact that we perceive. This is something in a lot of ways, well, ultimately there is no escaping perception, but that's for another video. We want to keep on this concept of the self, which, again, that's part of, but separate video. We'll get into that another time. So we have this concept of self, and we have the core self. But once we understand that it is malleable, we get into this idea of paradigm shifting. And that is where we change the ego and our identity. Okay, but your identity, in some ways, is different than the self. So on paradigm shifting, it's this self. What we're changing is our identity of the self. As I was saying, there is the perception, and then with that is the lens. And whatever type of lens, that taints our perceptions, that is our self. And that's where we can get into this idea of paradigm shifting, by choosing to believe different things. And you're like, well, how do I just choose to believe? Repetition is the best way that I have found. So if you simply decide that you want to believe in Buddhism for a set period of time, you would then begin studying Buddhism, and when you felt yourself doubting it, simply remind yourself, this is my faith now, and simply repeat. They say that once something's been repeated 3 times, it becomes truth within your mind. And there's some truth to that. We can train the self. We can tell our brain what we want on the lens of our perception, simply through repetition. We can also use self-hypnosis. I have a few videos on that, but I'm going to get into some more of that later on this idea of self-hypnosis. But that can speed up this process. But either way, what we're doing is we are changing circuitry in the brain, because that's where our concept of self as an identity is stored, is within our brain. So we want to create new circuits within our brain, and we can not just discover the self, but create the self. And there are limits to that. Okay, so we have this idea of identity, and then we can learn to change it, and that is paradigm shifting. A lot of times when you do these paradigm shiftings, it's good to have a set amount of time that you're going to be in that paradigm. Like, I've decided to believe in Buddhism concepts for the next 6 months. And at the end of that, then you should be able to realize that the time is set and step away from it to take the lessons from it that you can then apply to your craft. Or if you like Buddhism, there's nothing wrong with Buddhism. I'm not saying you can't be a Buddhist. You can't, but you can be a Buddhist and paradigm shift to other stuff and then come back. Because we have this idea of surface identity. If you're just doing it for 6 months, that's all you're really changing. You're simply changing the lens so you can get a different view of the world. Changing the angle at which you look at it, that you're looking at things, if you would prefer. So, it is important. But below that, we have, like I said, we have our core self. Yeah, these are things that, some of these can be changed over time. We pick up imprints and impressions through the years. And when we're talking about removing the ego, perhaps that's the most important part there. And that's what shadow work is for. Is, bad impressions and imprints in our psyche from trauma or from wherever it is. If you have imprints in you that you don't like, you can remove them with shadow work, talking to yourself, as I have discussed in previous videos, and we will get into other forms of shadow work as well in other videos. But the idea is to come to terms or identify these imprints or impressions within the self. And that's why I talk about the self-talk. You can ask yourself, well, why do I feel this way? It's kind of like if you were like with a psychoanalyst or a psychiatrist or whatever, laying on a couch with them sitting next to you, but you're both people, just talking back and forth. And that helps us get to these ideas and then find ways to confront them. But again, we'll do other videos on shadow work. We're talking more about the full self, the I. What exactly is the I? It is this idea of perception. I mentioned earlier that that is the one thing we can't escape. But even within perception, there's always going to be something about how we, in particular, perceive existence. And that's what this idea of ego death is for. So that we can reach out, because when we go all the way to ego death, we leave everything else behind. Yeah? Even the ego, which is our sense of identity. But still there's the I of perception. I like to think of it as in the eye of the storm. That center where the swirling chaos of everything that we are is around us. And in the very center there is the actual I. But that is with us even in an ego death experience. There is I, perception. And perhaps that is the self that we are trying to discover. And so the value of going to that moment within the understanding of oneself is that that is our core. Because even in that moment, we are still us. We are still our thread within the pattern, but we are nothing else. And it's important to understand what that core is, because that allows us to then move around our identity and move around our perception so that we can see problems or knowledge from more than one angle, and we are able to almost have more than one mind about things because we have different programs that we can look at it through to program our mind with. And that brings us to the next part of this. Yeah, another part of understanding this I and being able to paradigm shift from one reality or one perception of reality to another is the idea of completely changing the identity. With, I mentioned in previous videos the idea of soul shifting. Yeah, this is an important part of that. To know who you are. To understand that center I. Because that's what doesn't change. And once we know who that is, we lose that sense of panic when we start, when our identity starts slipping away. Because in order to soul shift, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing, is changing the shape and form of our aura into the new configuration. Whether that be in a frenzy gnosis, so that you're changing yourself so you're changing your soul into that of a wolf or bear, or whatever it is that you're going to be doing for that purpose. Once we understand the core self, it is easier to allow these transformations. And that is also how we prevent cognitive dissonance, which is another thing that we have to fight in order to see reality clearly. Because the more we see reality clearly, the more we're able to affect reality. So I think I've rambled on long enough. Thank you once again for joining us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. Until next time, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.